Story 1: The Whispering Trees. The forest was older than time itself. That's what the locals said. Anyway, the pines stood tall and unyielding, their trunks gnarled and twisted like the bones of ancient giants. The air was thick with the scent of sap and decay, and the sunlight barely pierced the dense canopy overhead. It was the kind of place that made you feel small, insignificant, like you were trespassing in a world that didn't belong to you. And yet, here we were. There were 5 of us: me, Jake, my girlfriend Lisa, our friends Mark and Sarah, and Mark's younger brother, Tommy. We'd been planning this camping trip for months, ever since Mark stumbled across an old map of the area in a thrift store. The map was yellowed and brittle, with cryptic notes scrawled in the margins. "Beware the whispering trees," and "They don't like visitors." We'd laughed it off, of course. It was just some old-timer's idea of a joke, right? Wrong. The first night, we set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by those towering pines. The trees were so close together that their branches intertwined, forming a natural roof that blocked out the sky. It was eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. "This place gives me the creeps," Lisa said, hugging herself as she stared into the shadows. "Relax," Mark replied, grinning as he hammered a tent peg into the ground. "It's just a bunch of trees. What's the worst that could happen?" Famous last words. That night, we sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The fire crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows on the trees. At first, everything seemed normal. But then, as the flames died down and the darkness closed in, we heard it. A whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like the sound of wind through leaves. But there was no wind. The air was perfectly still. "Did you guys hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Hear what?" Mark said, but I could tell by the look on his face that he'd heard it too. The whisper came again, louder this time. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping and blending together in a cacophony of sound. And then, clear as day, we heard our names. Jake, Lisa, Mark, Sarah, Tommy. Tommy, who had been quiet all evening, suddenly stood up. "I don't like this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We should leave." "It's just the wind," Mark said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Let's get some sleep. We'll feel better in the morning." But none of us slept that night. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent, until they felt like they were inside our heads. And then, just before dawn, they stopped. The first disappearance. The next morning, Tommy was gone. We searched the campsite, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. His sleeping bag was still in the tent. His backpack was by the fire, but Tommy was nowhere to be found. "Maybe he went for a walk," Sarah said, though she didn't sound like she believed it. "We should split up and look for him," Mark said, his voice tight with worry. We searched for hours, but the forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around us like a living maze. And then, just as we were about to give up, we found something. It was a note, written in Tommy's handwriting, pinned to a tree with a rusty nail. The paper was damp and crumpled, as if it had been there for years, but the words were clear. "The trees are alive. The second night. We should have left then. We should have packed up our things and run as far away from that forest as we could. But we didn't. Maybe it was pride or maybe it was fear, but we stayed." That night, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, more urgent, and they seemed to be coming from all around us. We huddled together in the tent, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The voices were inside our heads, whispering things we couldn't understand but somehow knew were meant for us. And then, just as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, we heard a scream. It was Sarah. We rushed out of the tent, but she was already gone. All that remained was her flashlight, lying in the dirt, and another note pinned to a tree. "They're watching." The third night. By now, we were all on edge. Mark was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself, while Lisa sat by the fire, staring into the flames. I tried to keep it together, but the whispers were getting louder, more insistent, and I could feel them pulling at the edges of my mind. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." But Mark shook his head. "We can't leave them here. We have to find them." That night, the whispers were deafening. They filled the air, the ground, the very fabric of reality, and they were calling our names. Jake, Lisa, Mark. And then, just as the sun began to rise, Mark disappeared. We found his hat hanging from a low branch, and another note pinned to a tree. "They're coming." The final night. It was just me and Lisa now. We didn't even try to sleep. We sat by the fire, holding hands, waiting for the inevitable. The whispers started as soon as the sun went down. They were louder than ever, and they were no longer just whispers. They were screams, howls, the sound of 1,000 voices crying out in agony. And then they stopped. The silence was worse. It was heavy, oppressive, like the calm before a storm. And then we heard it. A single word, spoken in unison by 1,000 voices. "Run." We didn't need to be told twice. We grabbed our backpacks and ran, stumbling through the darkness, the trees closing in around us. But no matter how far we ran, we always ended up back at the campsite. And then Lisa was gone. I found her flashlight lying in the dirt, and another note pinned to a tree. "You're next." The end. I don't know how I made it out of that forest. I don't remember running, or finding the road, or flagging down a passing car. All I remember is the whispers and the feeling of being watched. The authorities searched the forest, but they found no trace of Lisa, Mark, Sarah, or Tommy. The campsite was gone, too, as if it had never existed. But I know it was real. I can still hear the whispers, even now, in the safety of my own home. They're faint, but they're there calling my name. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the trees. They're closer than they were before, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. They're waiting for me, and I know it's only a matter of time before they take me too. The Whispering Trees is a story of primal fear, of nature turning against us, and of the unknown horrors that lurk in the shadows. It's a tale that will linger in your mind long after the campfire has burned out. A reminder that some places are better left unexplored, because the trees are alive, and they don't like visitors. Story 2: The Shadow in the Tent. The campsite was supposed to be a refuge, a place to escape the noise of the city, the endless buzz of phones, and the weight of responsibilities. For 5 friends: Maggie, Ben, Claire, Ryan, and Jess. It was a chance to reconnect, to laugh around a fire, and to forget the world for a while. But the woods have a way of reminding you that you're not welcome. The arrival. The drive to Black Pines Campground was uneventful, save for the occasional wrong turn and the growing sense of isolation as the trees closed in around the narrow dirt road. By the time they arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. "This place is creepy," Jess said, stepping out of the car and stretching, her breath fogged in the cool evening air. "It's perfect," Ben replied, grinning as he unloaded the cooler. "No cell service, no people, just us and nature." Maggie, ever the practical one, began setting up the tents while Claire and Ryan gathered firewood. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. As darkness fell, they lit the fire and settled in, passing around a bag of marshmallows and a bottle of cheap wine. The flames crackled, casting flickering light on their faces, and for a while, everything felt normal. But then they heard the knock. The child. It was soft at first, barely audible over the crackling fire. A faint tap-tap-tap on the fabric of the largest tent. "Did you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Probably just the wind," Ryan said, though he didn't sound convinced. The knock came again, louder this time. Maggie stood up, her flashlight in hand. "I'll check it out." "Be careful," Jess said, her eyes darting to the dark trees beyond the firelight. Maggie unzipped the tent and shone the flashlight inside. Empty. She turned to the others, shrugging. Nothing there. But as she started to zip the tent back up, she heard it. A small, trembling voice. "Can I come in? It's cold out here." Maggie froze. The voice was coming from behind her. She turned slowly, her heart pounding, and there he was, a boy no older than 8, standing at the edge of the firelight. He was pale, his skin almost translucent in the dim glow, and his clothes were tattered and dirty. But it was his eyes that made Maggie's breath catch in her throat. They were completely black, like two voids staring into her soul. Guys," Maggie called, her voice shaking. The others turned, their laughter dying as they saw the boy. "Whoa," Ben said, standing up. "Hey, kid, are you lost?" The boy didn't answer. He just stared at them, his head tilted slightly to the side, like a curious animal. "What's wrong with his eyes?" Claire whispered. "Can I come in?" The boy asked again, his voice soft and pleading. "It's cold." Maggie glanced at the others, unsure of what to do. The rational part of her brain screamed that this wasn't right, that they should send him away. But the boy looked so small, so vulnerable, standing there in the cold. "Okay," she said finally, "but just for a little while." The boy smiled, and something about it made Maggie's skin crawl. The first night, they gave the boy a blanket and sat him by the fire, but he refused to speak. He just stared into the flames, his black eyes reflecting the light in a way that made them seem even more unnatural. "What's your name?" Jess asked, trying to sound friendly. The boy didn't answer. "Where are your parents?" Ryan tried. Still nothing. After a while, they gave up and went to bed, leaving the boy in the tent with Maggie and Claire. That night, Maggie dreamed of shadows. They moved like living things, slithering across the ground and wrapping themselves around the trees. And in the center of it all was the boy, his black eyes glowing like coals. She woke up screaming. Claire was already awake, her face pale in the dim light of the lantern. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" Maggie asked, her heart still racing. "The whispers." They sat in silence, listening. First, there was nothing. And then, faint but unmistakable, they heard it. A soft, insistent whispering, coming from outside the tent. Maggie unzipped the tent and peered out. The fire had died down to embers, casting the campsite in deep shadows. The boy was gone. "Where is he?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. Maggie didn't answer. She was too busy staring at the trees. The shadows were moving. The second day. The next morning, the boy was back. He was sitting by the cold fire pit, staring at the ashes as if they held some secret. The others tried to question him again, but he remained silent. "We should take him to the ranger station," Ben said. "Someone must be looking for him." But when they tried to lead the boy to the car, he resisted, his small body stiff and unyielding. "I don't want to go," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "You can't stay here," Jess said, trying to sound firm. "It's not safe." The boy looked at her, his black eyes boring into hers. Nowhere is safe. They decided to stay another night, hoping the boy would come around. But as the sun set, the atmosphere grew tense. The whispers returned, louder this time, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, reaching toward the campsite. That night, Claire disappeared. The third night, they searched for hours, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. The boy watched them from the edge of the clearing, his expression unreadable. "This is your fault," Jess snapped, rounding on him. "What are you?" The boy didn't answer. He just smiled, and for the first time they noticed his teeth sharp and jagged like a predator's. That night, they heard Claire's voice. It was faint, coming from the trees, calling for help. They ran toward it, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, but they found nothing. And then the whispers started again. This time they were louder, more insistent, and they seemed to be coming from all around them. The shadows moved, twisting and writhing like living things, and the boy stood at the center of it all, his black eyes glowing. "You shouldn't have let me in," he said, his voice echoing in their minds. The end. One by one, they disappeared. Ryan was next, vanishing in the middle of the night. Then Ben, his screams echoing through the trees. Jess and Maggie tried to leave, but the road was gone. swallowed by the forest. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. And then it was just Maggie. She sat by the fire, her flashlight in hand, waiting for the inevitable. The boy stood at the edge of the clearing, watching her with those black, empty eyes. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice breaking. The boy smiled. "Because it's fun." And then the shadows swallowed her too. The shadow in the tent is a story of isolation, fear, and the unknown. It's a reminder that some doors should never be opened, and some visitors should never be invited in. Because once they're inside, they never leave. And the shadows are always watching. Story 3: The Lake That Never Gives Back. The lake was called Mirror's End by the locals, though no one could remember why. It was a vast, still body of water nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by towering pines and jagged cliffs. The surface was so smooth it looked like glass, reflecting the sky and trees with perfect clarity. But there was something wrong with it. The arrival. The group of friends, Ethan, Lauren, Greg, and Mia, had been planning this trip for months. They'd found the lake on an old map, its name circled in red ink with a note scrawled in the margin, "Don't stay after dark." They laughed it off, of course. It was just some old superstition, right? Wrong. They arrived at the lake in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the water. The air was cool and damp, and the silence was unnerving. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, just the occasional ripple as a fish broke the surface. "This place is amazing," Lauren said, setting down her backpack and staring out at the water. "Creepy, you mean?" Mia replied, shivering despite the warm weather. They set up camp on a small patch of grass near the shore, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they lit a fire and cracked open a few beers, the tension slowly melting away. But then, Ethan noticed something strange. "Hey, look at the lake," he said, pointing. The others turned, and for a moment, no one spoke. The surface of the lake was perfectly still, but it wasn't reflecting the fire or the trees or the stars. It was just black. "Weird," Greg said, frowning. "Must be the angle or something." But Ethan wasn't so sure. The first night, they went to bed early, exhausted from the drive and the hike. Ethan lay in his sleeping bag, staring up at the tent ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. And then he heard it, a soft, rhythmic splashing, like someone was wading through the water. He sat up, his heart pounding, and unzipped the tent. The lake was glowing. A faint, bluish light emanated from the depths, casting an eerie glow on the surrounding trees. The splashing grew louder, and Ethan saw something moving in the water, a dark shape just beneath the surface. "Guys," he whispered, shaking Lauren awake. But by the time the others joined him, the light was gone, and the lake was still once more. "You're imagining things," Greg said, though he didn't sound convinced. Ethan didn't sleep the rest of the night. The second day. The next morning, the lake was back to normal, its surface reflecting the sky and trees with perfect clarity. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. They spent the day hiking and swimming, though Mia refused to go near the water. "There's something wrong with it," she said, staring at the lake with a look of unease. "It's too still, too quiet." "It's just a lake," Greg said, though he didn't sound as confident as he had the night before. That evening, as they sat around the fire, Ethan noticed something else. The lake wasn't reflecting the fire or the stars. It was just black. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing. The others turned, and for a moment, no one spoke. "Maybe it's just the angle," Lauren said, though she didn't sound convinced. But Ethan wasn't so sure. The second night, they went to bed early again, the unease hanging over them like a dark cloud. Ethan lay in his sleeping bag, staring up at the tent ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. And then he heard it again, the splashing. He sat up, his heart pounding, and unzipped the tent. The lake was glowing again, the bluish light emanating from the depths. The splashing grew louder, and Ethan saw something moving in the water, a dark shape just beneath the surface. "Guys," he whispered, shaking Lauren awake. But by the time the others joined him, the light was gone, and the lake was still once more. "You're imagining things," Greg said, though he didn't sound convinced. Ethan didn't sleep the rest of the night. The third day, the next morning, the lake was back to normal, its surface reflecting the sky and trees with perfect clarity. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. They spent the day hiking and swimming, though Mia refused to go near the water. "There's something wrong with it," she said, staring at the lake with a look of unease. "It's too still, too quiet." "It's just a lake," Greg said, though he didn't sound as confident as he had the night before. That evening, as they sat around the fire, Ethan noticed something else. The lake wasn't reflecting the fire or the stars. It was just black. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing. The others turned, and for a moment, no one spoke. "Maybe it's just the angle," Lauren said, though she didn't sound convinced. But Ethan wasn't so sure. The third night, they went to bed early again, the unease hanging over them like a dark cloud. Ethan lay in his sleeping bag, staring up at the tent ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. And then he heard it again, the splashing. He sat up, his heart pounding, and unzipped the tent. The lake was glowing again, the bluish light emanating from the depths. The splashing grew louder, and Ethan saw something moving in the water, a dark shape just beneath the surface. "Guys," he whispered, shaking Lauren awake. But by the time the others joined him, the light was gone, and the lake was still once more. "You're imagining things," Greg said, though he didn't sound convinced. Ethan didn't sleep the rest of the night. The end. One by one, they disappeared. Greg was the first, vanishing in the middle of the night. Then Lauren, her screams echoing across the water. Mia and Ethan tried to leave, but the road was gone, swallowed by the forest. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. And then it was just Ethan. He sat by the fire, his flashlight in hand, waiting for the inevitable. The lake was still, its surface black and lifeless. And then he heard it, the splashing. He turned, his heart pounding, and saw something moving in the water, a dark shape just beneath the surface. "Guys," he whispered, shaking Lauren awake. But by the time the others joined him, the light was gone, and the lake was still once more. "You're imagining things," Greg said, though he didn't sound convinced. Ethan didn't sleep the rest of the night. The third day, the next morning, the lake was back to normal, its surface reflecting the sky and trees with perfect clarity. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. They spent the day hiking and swimming, though Mia refused to go near the water. "There's something wrong with it," she said, staring at the lake with a look of unease. "It's too still, too quiet." "It's just a lake," Greg said, though he didn't sound as confident as he had the night before. That evening, as they sat around the fire, Ethan noticed something else. The lake wasn't reflecting the fire or the stars. It was just black. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing. The others turned, and for a moment, no one spoke. "Maybe it's just the angle," Lauren said, though she didn't sound convinced. But Ethan wasn't so sure. The third night, they went to bed early again, the unease hanging over them like a dark cloud. Ethan lay in his sleeping bag, staring up at the tent ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. And then he heard it again, the splashing. He sat up, his heart pounding, and unzipped the tent. The lake was glowing again, the bluish light emanating from the depths. The splashing grew louder, and Ethan saw something moving in the water, a dark shape just beneath the surface. "Guys," he whispered, shaking Lauren awake. But by the time the others joined him, the light was gone, and the lake was still once more. "You're imagining things," Greg said, though he didn't sound convinced. Ethan didn't sleep the rest of the night. The end. One by one, they disappeared. Greg was the first, vanishing in the middle of the night. Then Lauren, her screams echoing across the water. Mia and Ethan tried to leave, but the road was gone, swallowed by the forest. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. And then it was just Ethan. He sat by the fire, his flashlight in hand, waiting for the inevitable. The lake was still, its surface black and lifeless. And then he heard it, the splashing. He turned, his heart pounding, and saw something moving in the water. A dark shape just beneath the surface. "No," he whispered, backing away. But it was too late. The lake swallowed him whole. The lake that never gives back is a story of fear, isolation, and the unknown. It's a reminder that some places are better left unexplored, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. Because once you see what's beneath the surface, there's no going back. And the lake never gives back what it takes. Story 4: The campsite that wasn't there. The forest was called Black Hollow, and it was the kind of place that didn't show up on maps. The locals avoided it, whispering stories of disappearances and strange lights in the trees. But for a group of friends, Emma, Jake, Rachel, and Tyler, it was the perfect spot for a weekend getaway. "No cell service, no people, just us and nature," Jake said, grinning as they piled out of the car. "And no way to call for help if something goes wrong," Rachel muttered, but she was smiling. They hiked deep into the woods, following a narrow trail that wound through the trees. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the sunlight barely pierced the dense canopy overhead. And then they found it, the campsite. It was an abandoned campsite, tucked into a small clearing. The tents were still standing, though the fabric was faded and torn. A fire pit sat in the center, filled with cold ashes, and personal belongings were scattered around. Backpacks, a pair of sneakers, even a half-eaten can of beans. "Weird," Tyler said, picking up a flashlight and clicking it on. The beam was weak, the batteries nearly dead. "Maybe they left in a hurry," Emma said, though she didn't sound convinced. They decided to set up camp nearby, close enough to use the fire pit but far enough to avoid the eerie feeling that clung to the abandoned site. As the sun set, they lit a fire and cracked open a few beers, the tension slowly melting away. But then, as the flames died down and the darkness closed in, they heard it. Footsteps. The first night. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackling fire. A soft crunch of leaves underfoot, like someone was walking just beyond the edge of the clearing. "Did you guys hear that?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. "Probably just an animal," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. The footsteps came again, louder this time, and they were accompanied by a low, guttural whisper. "Who's there?" Tyler called, his voice echoing through the trees. There was no answer, just the sound of footsteps circling the campsite. They spent the rest of the night huddled together, their flashlights trained on the trees. The footsteps continued, growing louder and more insistent, until they felt like they were right on top of them. And then, just before dawn, they stopped. The second day. The next morning, they searched the area, looking for signs of whoever, or whatever, had been watching them. But there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, just the eerie silence of the forest. "Maybe it was just the wind," Emma said, though she didn't sound convinced. They spent the day hiking and exploring, trying to shake the unease that hung over them like a dark cloud. But as the sun set, the tension returned. That night, the footsteps came again. This time, they were louder, more deliberate, and they were accompanied by the sound of laughter, soft and mocking, like someone was playing a cruel joke. "We need to leave," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "And go where?" Jake replied. "We're miles from the car, and it's pitch black out there." They spent another sleepless night, the footsteps and laughter circling the campsite like predators stalking their prey. By the third night, they were all on edge. The footsteps were constant now, accompanied by whispers and the occasional glimpse of shadowy figures moving between the trees. And then Tyler disappeared. They searched for hours, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. His backpack was still in the tent, his sleeping bag neatly rolled up, but Tyler was gone. "We need to leave," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "Now." But when they tried to pack up, they found that the trail was gone. The trees seemed to have closed in around them, forming an impenetrable wall. "This isn't possible," Jake said, staring at the dense undergrowth. "We came this way," but there was no arguing with the forest. That night, the footsteps were louder than ever, and the laughter was joined by screams. Tyler's screams. The journal. They found it the next morning, tucked under a rock near the fire pit. It was a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with cramped handwriting. The first entry was dated 3 months earlier. "We found the campsite today. It's perfect, quiet, secluded, just what we needed. But there's something off about it. The tents are still standing, but there's no sign of the people who left them. And the footsteps, I can't explain the footsteps." The entries continued, each one more frantic than the last. "The footsteps are getting louder. I think they're circling the campsite. Tyler says it's just animals, but I don't believe him. Tyler's gone. We searched for hours, but there's no sign of him. The forest, it's like it's alive. The trees are closing in and the trail is gone. We're trapped." The final entry was written in a shaky hand, the ink smeared as if the writer had been crying. "They're coming. I can hear them. The footsteps, the laughter, the screams. They're not human. They're something else. And they're coming for us." The end. One by one, they disappeared. Rachel was next, vanishing in the middle of the night. Then Jake, his screams echoing through the trees. Emma was the last. She sat by the fire, the journal in her hands, waiting for the inevitable. The footsteps were constant now, accompanied by whispers and laughter, and the shadowy figures were closer than ever. And then, she saw them. They emerged from the trees, their forms shifting and twisting like smoke. Their eyes glowed in the darkness, and their laughter was a low, guttural sound that made her blood run cold. "No," she whispered, backing away, but it was too late. They closed in around her, their laughter growing louder and more insistent, until it was all she could hear. And then, there was nothing. The campsite that wasn't there is a story of fear, isolation, and the unknown. It's a reminder that some places are better left unexplored, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. Because once you find the campsite, there's no going back. And the forest never lets go of what it takes. Story 5: The Radio Static. It started with the numbers. I was driving home from my night shift at the gas station, exhausted and half aware, my mind a hazy blur of fluorescent lights and cigarette smoke. The road stretched on like a black ribbon, empty except for the occasional gleam of headlights in my rearview mirror. I fiddled with the radio, looking for something to keep me awake. Static. More static. A brief snippet of an old rock song, then 7, 12, 16, 30, 9. The voice was female, soft and robotic, devoid of any inflection. I frowned, twisting the dial. It didn't stop. The numbers repeated, followed by a burst of static and then the sequence again. Number stations, I thought. Old Cold War relics. Spooky as hell, sure, but harmless. Still, something about this one unsettled me. Maybe it was the crackle of static underneath, like something breathing just out of range. Or the way the voice seemed off, the timing just slightly unnatural, as if it were waiting for something. I turned the radio off. The voice continued. I nearly swerved off the road. My fingers fumbled with the knob, turning it back on, off again. The numbers whispered through the speakers, unaffected. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for my phone to record it, but the moment I unlocked my screen, silence. I turned the radio back on. Normal stations played, music and late-night talk shows. No numbers, no static, just my own heavy breathing. I told myself I imagined it. Long shifts do that to you. The mind plays tricks. I went home, collapsed into bed, and convinced myself I'd forget it by morning. I was wrong. The next night, the voice returned. I was filling my car with gas when it crackled over the station's old intercom speaker. At first, I thought it was a customer calling for help. Then I heard it. 7, 12, 16, 30, 9. My stomach twisted into a knot. The intercom wasn't connected to a radio. It wasn't even turned on. I backed away, heart hammering, eyes scanning the empty station. The lone street lamp flickered. The numbers played again, softer this time, almost intimate, like someone whispering them directly into my ear. A cold gust of wind rushed through the station, knocking over a stack of newspapers. I bolted, leaving the pump running, my receipt fluttering to the pavement. I stopped listening to the radio. It didn't matter. The numbers found me anyway. I heard them in my apartment, nestled between the hum of the fridge and the wheezing of my old heater. They buzzed through my phone's speaker when I made a call, a faint echo beneath the dial tone. I even heard them when I closed my eyes at night, threading through my dreams like a needle through fabric. And then came the voice. One night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard it again. Softer now, not through any speaker but directly in my room. "You're next." I shot up, my breath caught in my throat. My apartment was dark, the kind of thick, oppressive darkness that swallows sound. But the whisper lingered, curling around me like smoke. I wasn't alone. I fumbled for my bedside lamp. The bulb flickered, dim and yellow, casting jittery shadows on the walls. My breath fogged in the air as if the room had dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Then I saw it. The radio. I didn't own a radio. It sat on my nightstand, rusted and ancient, its dial cracked and worn. Static poured from its speaker, crawling up the walls like fingers searching for purchase. The numbers played again, but this time they changed. They weren't numbers anymore. They were coordinates, and they led somewhere close. I should have ignored them. I should have run. But something in me, something primal and terrified, needed to know, needed to see. I followed them. The coordinates led to an abandoned transmission tower on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a sea of withered grass and broken fence posts. It loomed against the night sky, skeletal and rusted, a forgotten relic of an era long past. The static grew louder as I approached, the wind howling through the steel frame. My breath came in ragged gasps. I wasn't supposed to be here. The door to the station at the base of the tower was open, swinging gently in the wind. Inside, dust and decay clung to every surface. Old equipment lined the walls, dials and meters coated in a fine layer of grime. And then I saw it, the radio, identical to the one in my apartment. It sat on a metal desk, its speaker humming softly. A single piece of paper lay beside it, yellowed with age, covered in hastily scrawled numbers. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The ink had faded, but I could still make out the last line. "You're next." The radio crackled. The static shifted. The voice spoke again. Only this time it wasn't a whisper. It was right behind me. I don't remember running, but somehow I ended up back at my car, my fingers fumbling with the ignition. The headlights flared to life, slicing through the darkness, and for a split second, I saw movement near the tower. A figure, tall and thin, barely more than a shadow against the rusted steel. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if listening. The radio in my car turned on by itself. Static. Numbers. Then the whisper. "You're next." The last thing I remember is pressing my foot to the gas, tires screeching against the pavement as I tore away from that place. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe. I just drove. I threw the radio from my apartment off the bridge the next morning. I smashed my phone. I unplugged everything I could, buried myself in silence. But it doesn't matter, because at night, in the quiet spaces between sleep and waking, I still hear it. The static, the numbers, the voice, and I know, deep in my bones, that it's only a matter of time. Because no matter where I go, no matter what I do, I'm next.